Open up your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's been said, amateurs built the ark while the professionals built the Titanic. You ever heard that saying before? It's a good one. Amateurs built the ark, but professionals built the Titanic. And the historical account of David and Goliath is both iconic and even it's become colloquial. You know, how many times have you ever heard a particular event or situation described as a real David and Goliath struggle? It's what this is. You know, whether it's a football game or a political thing or whatever. It's a real David and Goliath struggle. And it's supposed to be about a little guy going up against insurmountable odds. And it is. But it's also about our fundamental source for all spiritual victory in our lives. And that is living in alignment with God. Living in alignment with God. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we go along. Because while you and I can never really comprehend what God has next for us, you hear me say this all the time, you never know what's around the next bend in the road, and it's true. You can be certain of one thing, though, and that is that God is preparing you now for whatever it is that's around the next bend in the road. That's what he does. He's not going to get around the next bend in the road and go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? Oh, Brian's up a creek without a paddle. You know, God doesn't roll that way. So he's preparing you and me for whatever it is that he has next. Now, Goliath, the soldier, Saul, the king, the entire armies of Israel and the Philistines, they were all the professionals. And along comes David, the amateur. And it doesn't exactly play out the way that anybody thinks it's going to play out. Let's start with 1 Samuel chapter 17, picking up in verse 29, and I'm going to read down to verse 37. And David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Then he turned from him towards another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first one did. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it, struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by the beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing as he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Okay, so you guys, if you've been here, you know the story as we're going through 1 Samuel. Saul, Israel's first king, his reign is in decline. And he was such a, I guess you'd say, a miserable and self-serving king that God said, you know what, you're not going to be king anymore. And so he sent Samuel the prophet to him and said, God's going to take the kingdom away from you and going to give it to somebody else, somebody who's after God's own heart, and that was David. So David was anointed to be the next king of Israel, but Saul is still the king. So the transition of power hadn't happened yet, and besides, David's just a young guy. He's been a shepherd out in the flocks, taking care of sheep, and he was a musician. So he sat out there, played guitar, wrote songs, and practiced some other things, which we're going to see here today. And so he's, who takes a kid like that and makes him king over an entire nation? Well, we're getting to that. Well, at this particular point in the narrative, the Philistines had come out to fight against Israel. And they lined up in this valley There's a valley between them. There's a hill on one side, hill on the other side. All the Philistines are over here. All the Israelites are over here. And they've all lined up, ready to fight, but they're not really going out and fighting yet because the Philistines kind of got their secret weapon. And it's this dude, Goliath. He's over 9 feet tall, big, and ugly, probably. I'm just thinking. But I mean, just for sheer size, the guy was intimidating, over 9 feet tall, which is not entirely unheard of in the world. I mentioned to you a guy, the tallest man in recent history died in 1940. He was 8'11". And so it's not unprecedented to have a guy over 9 feet tall, but here's a guy, 9 feet tall, MMA, cut, ready to rock, big gigantic sword, big gigantic spear, shield, armor, the whole thing. And as Saul says, Goliath's been a soldier since he was a kid. Now, I don't know what kind of parent does that to your kid, but there he is anyways, and dude's big, let's get him into something that'll, channel that youthful energy. Well, we'll make him kill people. So everybody's looking at Goliath thinking, who can beat this guy? And so Goliath comes out every day, steps out into the middle of the valley, and he trash talks Israel. Send out somebody to fight against me. If you can beat me, all of us back here will be your servants. But if I can beat your man, you'll be our servants. And no one was going out there to fight him. It was petrifying. Petrifying. What do you do with a guy like this? Now, David was still serving his dad. He was still taking care of the sheep, even though he got hired. You guys remember this. He got hired to be a musician to Saul. So Saul, when he'd get in a bad mood, they'd call David. David would come in, play the harp, and that would calm Saul's nerves just a little bit. So he got hired as being a musician in Saul's house, but he's also still working for his dad, taking care of the sheep. Now, a couple of David's brothers were in the army. So they're out there on the battle lines with Saul and the army, trying to decide what to do. Philistines on one side, Israelites on the other, Goliath in the middle, trash talking them. Every day Goliath comes out, trash talks Israel. And David's dad, Jesse, says, go out there to the battle line. I'm going to give you some snacks. Take them out there to your brother. Check in with them and see what's going on. Report back to me. So out there David goes. Now, while David is out there, he hears Goliath trash talking Israel. And so he starts looking around saying, who is this guy? You can see him do this, right? Who is this guy? And how come none of you guys are doing anything about it? And he says to some of the guys standing there, what's to be done for anybody that goes out and kills this guy? And they said, well, you got to marry the king's daughter, and he'll exempt your family from taxes, that's a big deal. He'll exempt your family. Could you imagine being completely exempted from taxes? That's a lot of money, I know. And so David's like, I'm down for that. Word gets back to Saul. Saul calls him in there. And this is what you got. Point number one. You've got a brave and an ignorant kid. That's what you got. David, seriously. Sit down. You don't realize what you're saying here. So David does what his dad tells him to do. Now, the funny thing is, when he goes out there and he hears Goliath trash-talking Israel, he starts inquiring, who is this guy and what's to be done for him? And the most grief he gets is from his oldest brother. So his oldest brother, in what verse was that? I don't know. It's in the Bible. No, verse 28, there it is, verse 28. Eliab, his oldest brother, it's like, why did you come down here? Well, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You have come down to see the battle. It's like you just came down here to watch. And that's from his oldest brother. Thanks, Eliab. Nice. So Saul gets word, sends for him, and in comes David to see the king. And the king, I don't know what Saul's thinking, seriously. But he entertains this kid long enough to have him into his tent and say, okay, what's up? And David's like, I'll go out there and kill him. And the king is like, no, you don't understand. Now, here's the deal. David comes in, and the first thing he does is he encourages the king. Did you notice that? Did you notice that in verse 32? Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Okay, don't be afraid. I'm here. I'll take care of this. And look, Eliab, his oldest brother, who gave him such grief for coming down there, he wasn't going out and volunteering to fight with this guy, and neither was Saul for that matter. But David comes in and says, okay, I'll go out. Now, that's encouraging, and he encourages him again down there in verse 37. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So David's encouraging the king of Israel. Don't be afraid. Now, Saul's assessment of David was factual. He had it right there in verse 33. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're a youth, and he's a man of war from his youth. Notice the first thing he does is he looks down on David because he's a young guy. He's a young guy. You can't look down on the young folks, can you? Now, sometimes we look at the young folks and we think they're brave, they're just ignorant. And I was thinking a lot about this because one of the things that happens when you get older is you get fear. You ever notice that? You get fear. See, when you're younger, you look at a thing and you go, man, let's do that. And then the old guy stands there and says, no, you could break your neck. I'm not going to go do that. You could put your eye out. Are you kidding? I'm not going to do that. And the young guy's like, no, man, it'll be great. So what? Yeah, I got another eye. I'll be fine, Break your neck, it'll heal. Don't worry about it. Come on, let's go. But you notice how David argued for his position here. He said, look, shepherds, that's no small thing. I got to protect the flock, lion, bear. I killed them both, man. Lion, bear, I don't know, how exactly he killed him. He says in one point, he says he grabbed it, caught it by the beard, struck it, and killed it. Dude, I don't know if you've ever been hunting before. The way that we hunt these days, is you don't just run up to an animal, jump on it, and grab it, and, knife the thing to death or something. I think that's tough, man. That's what young people do. They do crazy stuff, man. But notice how David argued. David didn't say, look, I have such strong faith, I can go out and fight this guy. He didn't say that, did he? It's not about David's faith, is it? It's about God in whom David had faith. Did you get that distinction? Now it's important because I want to lodge that in your head today. I want to tattoo it on your frontal lobes. It's not about David's faith. It's about God in whom he has faith. Now, look at how faith argues here. This is how faith argues. Faith doesn't say, wow, this is an incredible situation. I guess I'm just going to have faith for this. I don't know what else to do. That's not how faith argues. Faith argues like this. Look, God delivered me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear. He's going to do it with this guy too. See, faith argues from the past moving forward. You get that? In other words, if God did these things for me before, I can count on to do them again. You ever do that? Or you ever face a thing and say, wow, what am I going to do now? Instead of thinking, God's delivered me 8 zillion times. He's delivered me times that I never even knew that he delivered me, and he delivered me. So if he delivered me all these other times, and he brought me to this point right now, what's the likelihood that he's going to deliver me again? I'm thinking it's pretty good. That's how faith argues, because of what he's done in the past. Now, think about this. What is this? This is a book of what God's done in the past. Why do we have this book? So that we can know what God's going to do in the future. If he did all of this stuff here, what's the likelihood he's going to keep doing it? I'm thinking it's pretty good. If everything he ever said here has come true, what's the likelihood that the rest of it at the back of the book is going to come true also? You get the point, right? That's how faith argues, from the past moving towards the future. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10 is a good example of this. The Apostle Paul writing, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, 9 and 10, that's what I said. The Apostle Paul writing in kind of actually a moment of despair, he says, yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, get this, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a death and does deliver us, in whom we trust that he will still deliver us. You get that? The Apostle Paul had sufficient experience not only with God, but sufficient knowledge of God's word to know, you know what, God's going to deliver me. Even if it's a sentence of death, even if he takes my life, that's still deliverance. Go ahead, kill me. That's what God wants to do. I'm okay with that. Faith argues from the past moving towards the future. Now, David was a young guy, hadn't matured enough to be afraid, which, you understand that. I like what Alexander McLaren said in his commentary on this. He said, David conquered the temptation to share in the general cowardice. See, there wasn't anybody else that was volunteering to go out there and fight Goliath, right? Now, David could have got sucked right into that, couldn't he? Wow, it's like, if the professionals aren't going out there, the king isn't going out there, my oldest brother isn't going out there, these guys aren't going out there to fight with them, man, I got no place here at all. I need to just keep my mouth shut and go away. But which is worse? Think about this for a second too. Which is worse? The power of the internal conflict of wanting to give in to that general cowardice. Everybody else is a coward. How powerful would that be? Just trying to suck me in to being a coward like everybody else, or the giant that I'm saying I'm going to go out and face. Which is more intimidating? That's kind of a rock and a hard spot, isn't it? The circumstance that I face, or the temptation just to give in to fear and let that govern my life. Now, David was not brave for the sake of bravery. He wasn't macho. This wasn't bravado, chest thumping and going out there, come on, chest bump, let's go, Goliath, kill him. It wasn't that. It wasn't just him being macho. It was a confidence that was rooted in faith in God that gave birth to a willingness to accept or even ignore the risk. His confidence was rooted in God, not just in his ability to have faith in God, but it was rooted in God that gave birth to a willingness to accept or even ignore risk. Psalm 18, verses 16 and 19. Verses 16 to 19. Psalm 8, you can turn there if you want to. Psalm 18, verses 16 to 19. This is what God's word says. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters, he delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, from they who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He also brought me out into a broad place and delivered me because he delighted in me. That's you. That's the Lord. He brought you out. He's brought you out before. Let me ask you a question. You don't have to answer me out loud or verbally, but has God ever done anything for you ever? Ever? He's probably going to do it again. Does that strengthen or encourage your faith and trust in him right now for the things that you're facing right now? I hope so, because that's what it's supposed to do. There's nothing stronger than a man or a woman who is on God's side. That's an important distinction, who is on God's side. I'm going to come back to that. Point number 2, verses 38 and 39. So Saul clothed David in his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail, chain mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Okay, here's an important thing. You cannot wear somebody else's armor. You can't wear somebody else's armor. Now, let's think about this for a second. Saul was perfectly willing to send a young shepherd musician out to face this professional soldier. I don't know what that says about Saul, but okay, whatever. Nice leadership quality there. Let's see, what are your qualifications? Well, I'm a shepherd of the sheep, and I'm a musician. Okay, go fight that giant then, okay? 9 foot tall killing machine. You go out and deal with him. And I like what Saul says back there in verse 37. He says, okay, Go and the Lord be with you, because I won't be. Good luck, sucker. So wisdom would dictate that if David's going to go fight this guy, he needs some armor, right? This is a professional soldier. This is a battle situation. So, that's the kind of battle this is. This is what you do. All the professionals do this. David, all the professionals wear armor. He wears armor. I wear armor. Your brother wears armor. You need to wear armor too if you're going to go out and fight this guy. That's what the professionals do. But David had already killed a lion and a bear, and that's no small thing. I don't know if you've ever killed a lion or a bear, but I'm figuring that's a bit, especially with your bare hands and maybe a knife. I mean, that's tough. So, what good is the armor going to do now? Didn't wear armor for the lion or the bear. So why do I have to wear armor right now? Besides, David had a little trick up his sleeve, which we're going to get to in just a minute. Note again that David, it wasn't his own strength or skill that gave him victory over the wild animals. It was the Lord. It was the Lord. So what follows is logical. God delivered me from them. He's going to deliver me from him. And that's how faith reasons. Now, we talked about this a lot here over the years. When you're raised in a particular religion, or you're raised a particular way, maybe you're born into a family that's whatever it is that they are. I don't know. Pick whatever example you want. And you grow up with that religion or in that faith or whatever you want to say. It's really easy at some point or the other to say, okay, well, because my family is Catholic, I'm Catholic. I'm Catholic. That's what I am. Well, just because you're born into a family that goes into a particular religion doesn't make you that religion. What makes you that religion is when you decide that that's what you believe. That's what you believe, not what somebody else believes. You don't get into heaven because your parents are going to heaven. You're not kept out of heaven because your parents aren't going to heaven. You got to make the decision for yourself. What do you believe? That's how you get in. That's what you have to be born again by the Spirit of God. Not just my mom, she was a saint. She's there, so she's going to tell them all up there to let me in when I get there. That's not the way that it works. You don't go into heaven on somebody else's faith or somebody else's religion. It's between you and God, not between you and anybody else. It's got nothing to do with church. It's got nothing to do with organized religion at all. It's between you and the God that made you. You can't go in on somebody else's faith. And you know what? When you go and face the stuff that we face every single day, you can't go in on somebody else's armor. You got to suit up. You're the one that has to suit up. It's a battle. It's a fight. And the way that the world likes to do things today, the world around us, it's constantly pressing upon us to try to conform us to do things its way. This is the way that the world does it. This is the way the world wants you to do it. And it's a struggle. The Apostle Paul writes in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12, he says, "For I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed to him against that day." I know in whom I have believed. Do you know in whom you have believed? What do you believe in? Are you believing in a church? Are you believing in your faith? You believing in God. And even if you're saying you're believing in God, I'm saying, okay, God who? God who? Are you believing in the God as he has revealed himself in his word and through his son, or just some God that you made up or somebody else made up in their religion? What God? God who? Who are you placing your faith and trust in? Again, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8, the Apostle Paul writes and says, "He will also keep you firm to the end." He's going to see you all the way through whatever it is that you're facing. Now, the world has its own worldview. And the world wants to conform you to see things a particular way, to approach things a particular way, to think about things a particular way, to act and react to things in a particular way. And the world is trying to conform you into that every day. Every form of media that you see, TV, print, online, whatever it is that you want to see, there's this not so subtle forcing of you to see this is normal, this is natural, this is, everybody is like this. I remember talking with somebody about this movie, and the relationships in the movie were just so horribly dysfunctional. You guys pay attention. Every TV show, movie, whatever it is that you see, look at the relationships that are in there. They're all just horribly broken and tremendously dysfunctional, and nothing at all like the way that God would have you to conduct your relationships with other people. And yet, I said to this person, I said, man, that's pathetic. Look at these relationships in this. This is horrible. And this guy said, well, they're all that way. Everybody's relationships are that way. I'm like, no, they are not all that way. My relationships aren't that way. Are your relationships that way? I mean, how broken down and dysfunctional do you have to be to have relationships that look that way? And look, I know everybody's got damage. Everybody's got dysfunction in their life. I get that. I understand that. But to portray the dysfunction as being the norm, that's the norm. Not amongst God's people, it's not. Not if God's word has anything to say about it, and it does. It just doesn't have to be that way. God's people, we approach things differently. We have a different worldview. We see things differently. Most importantly, we see people differently than the world does. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 13 tells us about the armor of God and how he equips us. I'm not going to go through them all before. I've taught on it before. That stuff's online. But God gives us a way to equip ourselves every single day to face whatever it is that you're going to face in the day. So he's got us set up piece by piece. We're ready to go. Now, when I go into a fight, like getting out of my bed in the morning, that's when the fight begins. When I go into a fight, I want to go suited up with the armor that God gives me, not somebody else's armor, not somebody else's viewpoint, not somebody else's ideas, not somebody else's methodology. I want to go with what God equips me, how God equips me. And when I do, it's going to be a situation just like what we arrive at right now. Point number 3, and that's Goliath brings a knife to a gunfight. Verse 40. David. He leaves Saul, leaves all the armor behind. And David, he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. Oh, a sling. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. So Goliath even had an armor bearer there too. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. And who wouldn't? For he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword or the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Wow. Dude. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The whole scenario is surreal. It's so incongruous in so many ways. David the kid, probably no more than a teenager, going up against Goliath the giant soldier. Goliath's disdain for David. What is this? You can almost see him trying to spit on David. And David's God, in whom he had faith. Remember, get this emblazoned on your head, in your head. It's not David's faith, it's God in whom he had faith. What's the value of your faith? The value of faith is only relative to the object of your faith. If your faith is in God, it's unlimited, because God is unlimited. And David knew that the Lord was in this. He didn't seek approval from God. This wasn't where David said, Lord, this is what I'm thinking about doing, and I want you to approve my plan. David knew that this is what the Lord wanted to do, so he was just getting on God's side. But David was also not a fool, was he? Was he going to go up against Goliath and fight him 1-to-1 in exactly the same way that Goliath expected him to? Who could beat the sword of a guy that's 9 feet tall? Who could beat the javelin of a guy that's 9 feet tall? So, Goliath brought a sword and a spear. David brought a gun. You guys ever see Raiders of the Lost Ark? Okay, you remember the marketplace scene where Indiana Jones and the girl were being chased all over by these assassins that are trying to kill him. And at one point, Indiana Jones is chasing around trying to find the girl. The crowd parts, and here's this just bad-looking dude all dressed in black with this giant sword, and he's spinning the sword around, and everybody's like, and Indiana Jones just looks at him and goes, pulls out a gun and just shoots him. That's this. See, David's not an idiot. David's not going to say, give me a sword, that's 2 feet long up against a guy that's got a sword that's 6 feet long. He's not a fool. Now, think about this. David didn't fight him fair, but he fought him smart, didn't he? I'm not going to try to fight you with a sword. Are you kidding? You'd cut me to pieces. Before I even got to you, you would cut me down. I'm going to fight you smart. Now, as Christians, we live in a world that's hostile to our faith. The whole world system is hostile to our faith. Whether it's other religions or non-religious, whatever, they're hostile to our faith. And look, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 reminds us our fight isn't against the people. The people aren't the enemy. You need to understand that. It's not the people, it's the system. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. You guys know this passage. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Our fight isn't against people. Even the people that are yelling at you and getting in your face and screaming at you and calling you names, they're not the enemy. It's the ones that are motivating them to do that. Their own flesh, the world system, the devil himself. Motivating them to get in your grill and give you grief. Our fight isn't against people, it's against the system of the world. It's against our own flesh and our desire to have our own way and do our own thing. It's against the devil as well. Now, think about what David did here. And here's a good lesson for us. You can't fight the world, your own flesh, and the devil on their terms. David couldn't fight Goliath on Goliath's terms. He had to do things differently, and you and I have to do things differently too. Now, how does the world, or how does our own flesh, or how does the devil fight? Well, they don't necessarily fight fair either. As a matter of fact, the world fights very unfairly. And the world has all of the advantage because the world doesn't have a conscience. So it can tempt you with anything and everything. So I've said this many times about the devil. No blow is too low. About the very thing you think that he would never, throw up to tempt you with, he will. And your own flesh will lead you astray as well, because your flesh has got its desires as out of balance as they can be. Now, David going up against Goliath, he didn't take a sword out there. He took a sling, he took a rock. That's all he needed. Now, I'm thinking, if you are keeping sheep out in the field, you got a lot of time to practice with the sling, right? Have you ever seen somebody shoot a sling? You can get really good at it. And it's like shooting a gun practically. And it doesn't say it in the text. So I'm just speculating. But David's looking out at this guy And he's seeing this guy clad in armor from head to toe. And what does David see? The one spot that doesn't have any armor on it. Right between the eyes. Now, was David aiming for right between the eyes? I think he was. Did David know that he could hit him right in between the eyes? I think David did. David's like, are you kidding? Look at the size of this guy. Look at the size of the target. All I got to do is run up and sling this thing at him. Rock hits him in the head. He's done. Goliath brings a knife to a gunfight. Now, we've got battles that we have to face. We've got struggles. Anybody struggling with anything here today? Yeah, you better say yes. And God's Word gives us something here to take note of. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 to 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. Yep, we live in this world, right? Is anybody here that doesn't live in this world? No? Okay, good. You're all here. Important. We walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, they're not physical, but mighty in God for the pulling down of strongholds. You got a stronghold in your life? You got a stronghold in your life? Maybe you're facing a stronghold. Maybe it's not just internal, maybe it's external to you. You're looking at a circumstance or a situation and you're saying, that is hopeless. That will never change. That is an unscalable fortress of unimaginable height and built out of material that I can never ever tear down. I'm standing at the foot of a 1,000-foot tall granite wall and all I have is a spoon. How successful are you going to be? Well, you're not. Not with a spoon. But God gives us mighty weapons. And our warfare is not carnal, but mighty in God for the pulling down of strongholds. Got a stronghold in your life? God can pull it down. Do you believe that? Because if you don't believe it, it's probably not going to happen. But if you believe that He can and that He will, He will. I'm not saying it's always easy, and I'm not saying it always happens when we want to, but we've been given these weapons of our warfare that are not carnal, but mighty in God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Have you ever noticed that sometimes the battle goes just thought by thought? It's thought by thought. And if you've never tried it before, if you've ever tried fighting the battle in your own mind by saying, Lord, take that thought from me. And then the next time the thought comes up a nanosecond later, Lord, take that thought from me. Lord, take that thought from me. Lord, take that thought from me. You know what? After a while, you stop thinking about it. It's amazing. It actually works. You ought to give it a try sometime. And that's how God chooses for us to fight. Now, here's another thing to think about too, and this is no small thing. Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8, I'm quoting the New International Version. God's word says that whoever touches you touches the apple of His eye. Do you think that God won't defend you? Do you think that God doesn't care about you? That God doesn't care about the things that you're facing or the things that you're going through? You are the apple of God's eye if you've been born again by His Spirit. The New Living Translation of Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8 says, anyone who harms you harms my most precious possession. You are a precious possession to God, if in fact you are a child of God. First of all, you have to be born again to be a child of God. John chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. In order to be a child of God, you have to be born again. Not everybody in the world is a child of God. Everybody in the world is a subject of the King. But not everyone in the world is a child of the King. John chapter 1, verses 12 and 13 tells you how to become a child of the King. Now, He supplies you the greatest protection you could ever imagine. God Himself protecting you. And David knew that, and David knew the outcome even before he stepped on the battlefield. God is going to do it. In verse 47, the battle is the Lord's. And there's some things that you're going to face and that I am going to face, and we're going to have to look at them, and we're going to have to say, the battle is the Lord's, it's not mine. I can't do anything. Right? I can't do anything about it. That person, that situation, that thing that's in my life that I can't seem to get past, that battle is the Lord's. Long-term conflicts in your life right now? Take a close look at some of those things. Mike and I were just talking about this. Hardest thing in the world is look in the mirror. Hardest thing in the world. Look in the mirror. Look at the things that are going on in your life. And how many of them did you cause? How many of them are your fault? How many of them are things where I've been trying to get God onto my side, when in fact what we need to do is we need to get onto His side? That's a difference, isn't it? Fourthly and lastly, who was that masked man? Verse 52. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road of Shamraim, or wherever that is, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent, a little souvenir of the battle. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, that's the guy who's head of his army, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Ooh. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I'm the son of your servant, Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Who was that masked man? Look, living a life of faith. Living a life of faith, the Christian life, which is a life of faith, it's always going to confound the professionals. They're always going to look at you and say, no, that's not the way to do it. And you say, well, it's working for me. Saul was stunned in what he saw. David, he's the guitar player, right? You don't send a guitar player out to do stuff like that. But he just did it. Who is that kid? Because there's obviously more to this guy than meets the eye. People are going to figure that out about you too. They're going to figure out that there's more to you than meets the eye. See, what everyone saw was uncharacteristic in David. For David was just a step of faith. That's all it was. I think I told you about this recently. When we first moved up here, we had no place to live and circumstances weren't rolling our way, and we were only 2 weeks away from moving up here and thought we were going to have to live in a hotel. And, we did some crazy stuff that we thought was an act of faith, and some people that were around us down there at the time were like, man, you are an idiot. Why would you even do this? And we thought, well, you know what? We think this is where God's leading. And I want to be on God's side. You heard me say it before, wherever God leads, that's the best place in the world to be. And you might think, well, I don't want to go there. But if that's where God's going, that's where you want to go. That it's hard going that way. Yeah, it's hard, but that's where God's going. Man, it's filthy, it's dirty, I don't want to go there. Yeah, but it's where God's going, man. It's the best. Where God is, it's a fight. Yeah, it's a fight. It's a struggle. Yeah, it's a struggle. It hurts. It's hard. There's pain. Okay, we get that. But that's where God is, man. That's where I want to go. Just a step of faith. And it was a young guy. Sometimes what we end up doing in life is we end up looking for the most experienced and the most qualified for the position, right? That's what we want. You got no experience. You ever heard that going for a job? You got no experience, but you're thinking to yourself, you know what, man, I can figure this. I can do this. I can do this. Got no experience. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. God says this to you young people. Let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word and conduct, in love and spirit and faith and purity. If you're younger than me, which is a bunch of you, don't ever let anyone look down on you because you're young. God chose David to be the king over all Israel when he's just a teenager. Jesus started his ministry, he was only 30 years old, died at 33. If you want more, a little closer to the home examples, Greg Laurie, a lot of you guys know who he is. He was pastoring a church at 20. He had no experience. Chuck Smith sent him out there, gave him a check, start a church, dude. 20 years old. I mean, we look at young people and we think, well, they're just, so full of energy. They need to grow. They need to learn. They need to mature. Look, you start maturing much and all you're going to get is fear. Sometimes we got to turn the young people loose. And let me tell you something. When you're aligned with God and you're aligned with His purpose, then wild things are going to happen. And those of us that are a little bit older, we got to learn how not to be afraid. We got to learn how not to be afraid. Because we belong to the Lord, wild stuff is going to happen, man. Are you okay with that? A good example of that is Gideon, Judges chapter 6. Gideon, everybody was afraid. Everybody was afraid. Gideon was afraid, and an angel of the Lord came to Gideon. Said, hey, you mighty warrior. That's what he called him. Come on out and fight. And Gideon's like, you're obviously not talking to me. I'm threshing wheat inside of a wine press because I'm afraid. And God used this young guy, Gideon, who was afraid. And he put together an army of only 300 to defeat an army of a multitude more than 300. It's one of the greatest stories of the Bible. Look at Judges chapter 7. Look, the battle is not about how big the enemy is. The battle is not about how many problems you have. The battle is not about how strong you are or about how strong you are not. It's not about what you can take or about what you cannot take. It's about God. It's about God. It's about how big He is. It's about what He can do and what He is capable of. It's not whether it's not about whether He's on your side. It's about whether you're in alignment with Him. That's the point. It's not about getting God on your side. It's about getting you on God's side, and that's a massive distinction. So the implications of the story are enormous. David goes out there and kills Goliath. Being aligned with God, like David was, is a source of incredible confidence in life. Because you realize that your life and the struggles that you face, the good things too, and the bad things as well, it's not about you. It's never about you. It's never been about you. It's not going to be about you. It's about God. It's about what He's doing in your life. It's about you getting aligned with Him and letting Him do what He wants to do His way in you and through you. And that can be difficult sometimes because we want to do it our way. And that kind of walk with the Lord, that walking in faith with what God's doing in your life, who He is, that kind of walking in faith, it's a powerful witness to the world around you. Because I was able to I've been here for 15 years now, to go back to some of those same people back in Southern California that told me I was an idiot and say, yeah, I've been here for 15 years. Let me tell you what the Lord's done. So who was right and who was wrong? I took a step of faith and I found that I was aligned with God in that purpose. How about you? How are you doing? And let me leave you one last confidence builder. Up here in verse 40, did you notice this? When David goes out to fight Goliath, it says that he picks up 5 smooth stones out of the brook, but he only used 1 to kill Goliath. It's all he needed. Now, what was David thinking? And I don't know. This is pure speculation. Was he thinking, okay, in case I miss, I got 4 more opportunities to shoot the guy down? I don't know. We find out later in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 15 to 22, that the Philistines had 4 other guys that were just as big and just as bad as Goliath. Some people think that they were brothers of Goliath. So how many of them were there all total? There were 5. How many stones did David pick up? Picked up 5. He took 5 out there. I'm thinking David saw these 5 guys and said, I'll kill them all. So, I don't know. What do you face? You face 1 giant, 5 giants, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how many giants you face. But you can take into your battle the boldness that comes from knowing that I'm aligned with God and with His purpose. Now, how do you do that? What's the greatest source of confidence? It's being born again by the Spirit of God. Being indwelt with the crucified and resurrected Christ.